Eyes on the ridge, Charlie. I think they're digging in up there. We have authorization to fire at will.
Move up! Keep moving! Get to the seawall!
June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. The sky is overcast, the air thick with the scent of earth and salt from the nearby sea. The thunderous roar of Allied artillery fills the morning air, but it is not enough to mask the deafening clamor of distant explosions. On the beaches of Utah and Omaha, the land is being torn apart as men of the 29th and 4th Infantry Divisions struggle to push inland. Their bodies are already heavy with the weight of combat, their minds burdened with fear and determination. In the distance, the jagged coastline stretches like a scar, a barrier between them and a victory they may never reach. Sergeant Hayes, wearing the faded insignia of his unit, squints against the smoke rising from the beach. His battalion, caught in a deadly crossfire, is pinned down in a gully, a narrow, crumbling ravine offering little cover from the German positions on the high ground. In a desperate moment of clarity, Hayes knows the danger is not just from the enemy's guns. It is from the uncertainty, the helplessness that binds his men. He steps forward, his hand gripping the worn barrel of his M1 Garand. The call to action pulses through him, a quiet resolve blooming under the chaos. It is a risk, a gamble. But in the war-torn landscape of Normandy, risk and survival often walk hand in hand. Sergeant Hayes makes a choice that will alter the course of this battle, this day, and, perhaps, the war itself. By the time Sergeant Hayes stepped forward on the morning of June 6, 1944, the world had already felt the heavy rumblings of war for nearly 5 years. The conflict that had begun with the German invasion of Poland in 1939 had escalated across continents, leaving destruction in its wake. Europe was entrenched in a brutal struggle between the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allied forces of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and numerous other nations. The Eastern Front had seen staggering losses, while the Pacific Theater was embroiled in island-hopping battles between American and Japanese forces. But in Europe, the invasion of France was now poised to become the turning point of the war. The Allied leadership had long known that the liberation of Nazi-occupied France would be a monumental task. For months, the Allied forces had been meticulously planning Operation Overlord, a massive amphibious assault aimed at breaking through the heavily fortified German defenses along the Normandy coast. The invasion would be the largest amphibious operation in history. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Free French forces were converging on this stretch of French coastline, an area that, under Hitler's command, had become the fortress of Europe. For weeks, deception operations had been underway, convincing the German High Command that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, further to the north. This allowed the Allies to muster their forces in secrecy, building up the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. The night before the assault, paratroopers and glider troops from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines to secure key bridges and towns, disrupting German reinforcements and communication. Yet, despite the element of surprise and the careful preparation, the landing on the beaches of Normandy was anything but smooth. The Germans, entrenched in their coastal defenses, were ready. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery positions lined the cliffs above the beaches, while tanks, bunkers, and barbed wire made the terrain nearly impassable. The assault began at 6:30 hours when the first waves of American forces, divisions like the 1st, 29th, and 4th Infantry, hit the sand. Utah Beach, where Hayes' battalion landed, was a relatively less defended beach compared to Omaha, but it was still littered with obstacles. The soldiers who made it to the shore were met with fire from hidden German positions. For the men of the 4th Infantry Division, the situation was grim. As they advanced inland, They encountered resistance from German forces in well-constructed defensive positions, snipers, machine guns, and artillery that cut them down in droves. The terrain was not their only enemy. As Sergeant Hayes and his men soon learned, the challenge of surviving the assault was compounded by poor coordination and the confusion of battle. The heavy bombardment meant to soften up German defenses had not been as effective as hoped. Communication lines were severed, and many units found themselves scattered across the landscape, isolated from one another, and without clear orders. Waves of soldiers came ashore, but not all found the right path. Within hours of the initial landings, many of the planned objectives were still far from secure. The paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines, found themselves in intense firefights. At Utah Beach, the situation was dire. Hayes' battalion, pinned down by German milligram 42 machine guns and mortars, had no choice but to hold position and attempt to regroup. The invasion was supposed to be a breakthrough, an opportunity to drive deep into enemy territory. But the grim reality of war, coupled with the harsh weather conditions and the German determination, made the battle uncertain. Sergeant Hayes, facing the brutal reality of battle, found himself at a pivotal moment. His decision to take a risk, leading his men forward under the weight of enemy fire, was more than just an individual act of courage. It was a microcosm of the broader struggle for survival that unfolded across Normandy. What was expected from the Allies was not merely tactical prowess or sheer numbers, but the ability to push forward through chaos, to transform fear into action, and to trust in the strength of brotherhood. The stakes of June 6, 1944, could not have been higher. The success of the invasion was critical not just for the liberation of France, but for the survival of the Allied war effort in Europe. If the landings failed, if the beachheads were not secured, the entire war could have been thrown into disarray. The loss of France would have meant the continuation of Nazi domination of Western Europe, leaving the Allies no foothold on the continent from which to launch a counteroffensive. Time was not on their side. Sergeant Hayes and the men of the 4th Infantry Division, like those of the 29th, were tasked with taking Utah Beach, one of the 5 landing zones. Unlike the men of Omaha Beach to the north, who faced ferocious resistance from entrenched German forces, the troops at Utah were met with a slightly less fortified defense. Nevertheless, the terrain posed its own challenges. While the beach was wide and the cliffs were lower, the dense German minefields and the boggy, marshy terrain inland made progress painfully slow. As Hayes' battalion fought through the obstacles, it became apparent that not all of the landing units were equipped to deal with the terrain and the unpredictable fire from hidden German positions. Engineers and medics, loaded with equipment and supplies, found themselves in the thick of battle, often at the mercy of German artillery. Commanders on the ground had to make crucial decisions quickly, and often they were separated by distances and chaos, unable to maintain the level of control needed to direct the battle effectively. Within the first hours, Hayes' battalion was faced with a grim reality. Many men were injured, some gravely. The disarray of the initial landing had left the soldiers vulnerable, isolated, and confused. Yet, despite the harrowing conditions, the men fought. It was not the sheer strength of firepower that would win this battle, but the grit, determination, and courage of those who stood their ground in the face of overwhelming odds. At the same time, the German forces, while entrenched in their coastal fortifications, were also facing their own challenges. Hitler's strategy, the infamous Atlantic Wall, was not without its flaws. Despite the fortifications and well-laid defensive positions, the Germans had underestimated the scale of the Allied assault. The weight of the attack, compounded by the shock of airborne landings and the overwhelming air superiority of the Allies, left the German forces in Normandy scrambling. Despite their readiness for a fight, the Germans struggled to coordinate and respond quickly enough to halt the advancing Allied forces. Yet, the German forces still had a tactical advantage in many places, particularly on the high ground. The beaches, where the Allies were concentrated, were vulnerable to sniper and artillery fire from the cliffs. It was here that Sergeant Hayes's risk would ultimately pay off. In the face of the harrowing uncertainty, he understood something that many of his superiors had not yet realized. That in this fight, the ability to move fast, to take calculated risks, and to fight through confusion could be the difference between life and death. The Allies' efforts on D-Day were not the smooth, well-coordinated assault that many had hoped for, but a messy, chaotic series of battles. Some battalions were overwhelmed by enemy fire, while others made significant progress. Commanders like General Bradley, overseeing the landing, quickly adapted to the fluid situation, altering objectives and shifting priorities. The landing forces, despite taking heavy casualties, were not broken. They pushed inland, slowly, step by step, as the battle for Normandy began to unfold. The men of the 4th Infantry Division, as part of the American contingent, played a pivotal role in the success of the Utah Beach landing. But this success was not just about tactical superiority. It was about the willingness to adapt, to press forward when every instinct screamed to retreat. In this way, Hayes's decision was emblematic of a larger truth that would come to define the Normandy campaign. The ability to endure and the ability to make bold, decisive moves in the face of confusion and chaos were crucial to the Allied success. In the midst of the smoke and destruction, Sergeant Hayes's decision to step forward was a testament to the unwavering determination of the men who fought that day. He, like many of his fellow soldiers, was not immune to fear, doubt, or exhaustion. What distinguished him, however, was the ability to recognize that leadership in moments of chaos was often about making the hardest choices. It was about deciding, in the face of overwhelming odds, that retreat was not an option. Hayes had seen his comrades fall around him. He had seen the hopelessness in their eyes as they lay wounded or dead in the surf. But where others saw despair, Hayes saw a chance to lead, to inspire his men to push forward, even when the enemy had the high ground. His leadership was not defined by the orders he gave, but by the example he set, as he strode forward into the very heart of danger. It was the quiet resolve of the man who understood that the fight was as much psychological as it was physical. When men like Hayes moved forward, their courage often became the catalyst for others to follow. And in that moment, it was the promise of survival, the promise of the future, that spurred them on. The sacrifice of the soldiers on D-Day is something that resonates beyond the battlefield. Every man who charged the beaches, who risked everything for a sliver of hope, was carrying the weight of something larger than themselves. They carried the hopes of millions of people who believed in the freedom and democracy that they were fighting for. The battles fought in Normandy would soon give birth to a new chapter in the Allied march across Europe. But on that first day, the courage of men like Sergeant Hayes carried the hope of an entire world in peril. From a tactical perspective, the landing at Utah Beach was one of the more successful aspects of the D-Day invasion. The 4th Infantry Division had a critical mission: secure the beachhead, neutralize the coastal defenses, and link up with airborne units to push further inland. The initial landings were met with much less resistance than at Omaha Beach, where entrenched German forces had dug in deeply and established powerful defensive positions. But the terrain at Utah was still treacherous. Muddy fields, hidden minefields, and the dense network of German positions made progress slow and dangerous. The decision to land the 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach was a calculated risk by the Allies. While other beaches were more heavily fortified, Utah was chosen because of its relatively weaker defenses, which could be overcome by swift, aggressive tactics. The airborne units that dropped behind enemy lines were meant to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beach, but not all of these units had landed as planned. Many had been scattered by the weather and had not secured their intended positions. This miscoordination added an additional layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Yet, despite these challenges, the 4th Infantry Division quickly adapted. The soldiers advanced carefully but decisively, using fire and movement tactics, suppressing enemy fire long enough to advance and neutralize strongpoints. But this would not have been possible without the critical leadership decisions made in those initial, brutal moments. Sergeant Hazy's decision to push his men forward, under heavy fire, was not just a courageous act, it was a tactical one. It was about understanding that breaking the deadlock required action, even when the tactical advantage was not fully in their favor. And in that moment, the tactical move to press the attack, rather than wait or regroup, became a turning point for the battalion. Technology, in the form of weaponry and support systems, played a crucial role in the D-Day landings, but it was not without its flaws. The American forces were armed with the M1 Garand rifle, the M1911 pistol, and various machine guns like the Browning automatic rifle, but it was the heavy artillery and air support that often proved more effective in the early stages of the invasion. The Allied forces were also supported by specialized vehicles designed to clear obstacles on the beach and neutralize enemy positions. The most famous of these was the Hobart's Funnies, a series of modified tanks designed for assault operations. These included flame-throwing tanks, tanks with giant roller devices to clear mines, and tanks with bulldozer blades to clear obstacles. Despite the promise of these technologies, the execution was less than perfect. Many of the landing crafts, for example, were not as effective in the rough seas as the Allies had hoped. Some were destroyed or damaged even before they reached the beaches. The air support, though substantial, often missed its targets due to poor weather and the challenges of coordinated timing. And the heavy bombardment meant to soften up German defenses did not always hit the mark, leaving some German positions intact and ready to inflict heavy casualties. Yet, it was the adaptability of the American soldiers and their willingness to use the technology available to them in creative ways that made the difference. The use of infantry and armor together allowed the men of the 4th Infantry Division to press forward despite technological setbacks. The tanks, though imperfect, provided crucial suppression against German machine gun nests, while the soldiers with their M1 Garands made critical advances when necessary. The failure of technology in many places only highlighted the importance of human initiative, of pushing through the gaps where the machines failed. The leadership demonstrated on June 6, 1944, was a defining characteristic of the Normandy landings, and Sergeant Hayes's actions epitomized the kind of leadership that turned the tide of war. Leadership in combat is often tested not by the big decisions, but by the small, personal ones. In moments of chaos, when the fog of war hangs thick in the air, leaders must often make choices with limited information, risking not only their own lives but the lives of those they command. For Sergeant Hayes, the battlefield was no different. The role of leadership in shaping the outcome of D-Day cannot be overstated. Generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who led the overall planning of the invasion, and Bradley, who was directly in charge of the American forces in Normandy, played pivotal roles in the success of the landings. But it was men like Hayes, who led their troops in the trenches, under direct fire, that defined the battle's outcome on the ground. Hayes' decision to risk his life and lead from the front exemplified the leadership ethos that inspired his men. He did not hide behind orders or directives. Instead, he understood the essence of leadership. It was about setting an example, about showing courage, even in the most perilous of circumstances. The soldiers under his command were not just following a series of tactical orders, they were following their leader, whose actions created a ripple of courage throughout the ranks. The success of Utah Beach, despite the chaos, was in no small part due to the ability of junior leaders like Hayes to adapt quickly, make decisions on the fly, and keep their men moving forward. It was about maintaining momentum when everything around them screamed to stop. For every officer or sergeant like Hayes, there were countless others who embodied the same principles of leadership, guiding their men through one of the most perilous days of the war. Their actions, often unnoticed by the broader historical narrative, were integral to the success of D-Day and the ultimate Allied victory in Europe. It was leadership on the ground, not just on the battlefield, that made the difference. For the German soldiers, June 6, 1944, was a day of confusion, surprise, and eventual despair. The Allies had spent months preparing, staging elaborate deception campaigns to keep the Germans guessing. The invasion was not a complete surprise, but the specific timing, location, and scale were. Hitler's Atlantic Wall, which was designed to keep the Allies at bay, was a massive, heavily fortified defense system stretching from Norway to Spain. Yet, when the Allies struck on D-Day, they found the Germans divided, scattered, and unsure of the scale of the assault. At Utah Beach, the German defenders were primarily from the 709th Infantry Division and local coastal defense units. These soldiers were tasked with holding the beach, but their strength was spread thin across a large area. Many of them were unprepared for the ferocity of the Allied landings. As the American forces came ashore, German resistance was fierce but not as well coordinated as it could have been. Commanders had failed to concentrate their forces where the Allies were landing, and the lack of clear communication meant that German positions were vulnerable to the swift advances of the 4th Infantry Division. For the Germans, the battle was a race against time. Despite their readiness, the German leadership was divided in its response. The commander of the German forces in Normandy, Erwin Rommel, had long feared that an Allied invasion was imminent, but his warnings had often been dismissed or delayed. In the chaos of D-Day, Rommel was away from his command post, and German leadership faltered under the weight of the surprise assault. The Nazi forces on the beaches of Normandy were in disarray, unable to mount an effective defense in the critical early hours of the invasion. For the soldiers in the German positions, the moment they faced the American assault was a grim realization of their vulnerability. Despite their strong defensive positions, they were fighting a battle on their terms, with their backs to the sea and no clear reinforcements. The relentless Allied bombardment, coupled with the constant assault from the air and sea, meant they were trapped in their positions, unable to retreat or regroup. German soldiers, many of whom were conscripts or from secondary divisions, found themselves fighting against an overwhelming and highly organized enemy force. The psychological toll of the invasion was immense for the German troops, who had expected another stalemate, but instead were faced with the reality of a massive, all-encompassing offensive. For the Germans at Utah Beach, June 6, 1944, was the beginning of the end. The initial surprise of the landing left them reeling, and their inability to respond decisively would cost them dearly. The Allies, despite the difficulties they faced on the beaches, had gained the momentum, and that momentum would carry them all the way to Paris. From a moral standpoint, the D-Day invasion was a turning point not just in the war, but in the story of human conflict. The men who fought that day, on both sides of the beach, were not merely soldiers. They were human beings caught in a conflict that had long since stopped making sense. For the Allies, the battle was about liberating oppressed peoples, restoring freedom to a continent that had been torn apart by totalitarianism. For the Germans, it was a desperate defense of an ideology that had wreaked untold suffering. Yet, despite the ideological differences, the men on the ground shared something more primal: the will to survive. At Utah Beach, the soldiers faced the same universal struggle, no matter their side. The shock, fear, and exhaustion that gripped both the Allied and German forces reflected a shared human experience in the face of war. In this moment, the soldiers who pushed forward, led by figures like Sergeant Hayes, did not just fight for their country. They fought for each other, for survival, and for the hope that they might one day return home. The moral questions of war were always present, but in the case of D-Day, there was a clear moral urgency for the Allies. The fight was about more than victory. It was about stopping an ideology that threatened to engulf the world. The American soldiers who landed on Utah Beach, and those who fought across the entirety of Normandy, were part of something larger than themselves. They were part of a moral cause, one that, despite the horrors of war, represented the possibility of a better future. As the morning sun of June 6, 1944, climbed higher in the sky, the fate of the invasion rested on the actions of individual men like Sergeant Hayes. The battle on Utah Beach was not just a fight for territory, it was a race against time. The soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division had been tasked with a vital mission: to secure the beachhead, neutralize the German defenses, and link up with airborne units to create a secure corridor inland. The success of the landings depended on a fragile thread of momentum, one that could snap under the pressure of German resistance. And it was in this fraught moment that Sergeant Hayes would make the decision that could change everything. Pinned down in a narrow ravine, with the German positions and the high ground above them, the battalion was caught in a deadly crossfire. The constant rain of bullets and mortar shells seemed unrelenting. To stay in place was to invite annihilation. Yet to advance was a risky move, one that could cost the battalion its leadership, its cohesion, and its fighting spirit. The men, exhausted from the brutal landing and the early hours of the battle, were uncertain, frightened, and unsure of the way forward. It was in the midst of this disarray that Hayes recognized the pivotal moment, the one that could either secure their survival or see them doomed. For Sergeant Hayes, the decision was simple, though it carried with it the weight of the entire battalion. He would lead his men forward, into the heart of the German defenses. The fear and confusion that hung over the soldiers like a thick fog would be replaced by the clarity of action. He knew that the key to breaking the stalemate was not to wait for reinforcements or hope for air support. It was to take the initiative, to press the attack despite the uncertainty. Hayes stepped forward, making his way through the chaos of the battlefield, calling on his men to follow him. It was an act of bravery, a gamble. But the risk was calculated, driven by the belief that hesitation would lead to failure. As Hayes moved ahead, the fire from the German machine guns intensified. Bullets whipped past him, striking the ground and splintering the air around him. His men, seeing their leader move forward, followed him into the hellish torrent of fire. For a moment, it felt as though the beach itself would swallow them whole. Yet, despite the horror, the men advanced. Hayes' decision was the spark that ignited a chain reaction. Each step he took, each command he issued, was like a thread being pulled, unraveling the tightly wound web of German resistance. At that moment, the German defenders realized that their advantage, the high ground, the entrenched positions, was not enough to stop the American advance. The unexpected boldness of the American soldiers, the relentless drive to push forward, turned the tide. The Germans, caught off guard by the audacity of the attack, found themselves unable to mount an effective counteroffensive. They had expected the Allies to hesitate, to falter. But Sergeant Hayes had made the crucial move. He had pressed the attack when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. This moment, this brief but crucial turning point, would have far-reaching consequences. As Hayes and his battalion fought their way forward, the rest of the American forces on Utah Beach began to make their own breakthroughs. The shock of Hayes' actions sent ripples through the entire operation, boosting morale and inspiring others to follow suit. The German defenses, though formidable, began to crack. What had seemed like an impossible beachhead was now within the grasp of the Allies. At Utah Beach, the tide of war was shifting. The Germans, despite their formidable defenses, were being pushed back. And it was this critical turning point, this pivotal moment in the battle, that set the stage for the broadest success of the Normandy landings. It was a gamble, one that, in the end, paid off. The breakthrough on Utah Beach was not an isolated event. It was a defining moment that reverberated throughout the entire Normandy campaign. As Sergeant Hayes and his battalion continued their push inland, the Allied forces were slowly but surely establishing a foothold on the continent. The Germans, realizing that their defensive positions were no longer secure, began to retreat. But the momentum created by Hayes' bold decision was not just tactical, it was psychological. The soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division were no longer fighting only for survival. They were fighting for a cause that had now gained new significance. Every step forward, every piece of ground gained, was a small victory in the broader struggle for liberation. The men who had been pinned down in the ravine, uncertain and afraid, now moved with purpose. They had seen their leader take the first step, and they followed him without question. For Hayes's battalion, and for the soldiers across the beachhead, the tide had turned. The moment Sergeant Hayes advanced into the German fire was the catalyst that set the 4th Infantry Division on the path to success. But it was also the moment that symbolized the broader struggle of the American forces in the war, how they would not be content with simply surviving, but would press forward with relentless determination. Hayes's courage was not just about personal valor. It was about embodying the spirit of the American fighting forces in the face of overwhelming odds. It was about refusing to be cowed by the enemy, refusing to accept defeat. By midday on June 6th, the beachhead at Utah Beach had been largely secured. The men of the 4th Infantry Division had made significant progress inland, and German resistance, though still present, had been severely weakened. It was a testament to the resilience of the men who fought, to the leadership that inspired them, and to the unyielding spirit that had driven the Allied forces since the first shots of the war were fired. This success, though crucial, was only the beginning. As the Allies pushed further into France, the road ahead would be filled with hardship and uncertainty. But the events of D-Day, and the courage shown by men like Sergeant Hayes, would prove to be the foundation on which the liberation of Western Europe was built. At the heart of it all, however, was the sacrifice and bravery of those who fought in the first hours of the invasion. Without the bold leadership of figures like Hayes, without the courage of the men who followed him into the breach, the outcome of the war, could have been very different. The Battle for Normandy was a fight for freedom, but it was also a fight for the ideals of democracy that the Allies held dear. The bravery of Sergeant Hayes and his battalion exemplified the very essence of what it meant to fight for those ideals. It was not about territory. It was about the future of the world. It was about ensuring that tyranny would not rule, that the forces of oppression would not succeed. In that pivotal moment on Utah Beach, as Hayes led his men into battle, he was not only fighting for his own survival, he was fighting for a cause much larger than himself, for a cause that would shape the course of history. By the end of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy had witnessed the full force of the Allies' assault. The men of the 4th Infantry Division had secured Utah Beach, making significant inroads despite the heavy casualties and unrelenting enemy fire. Sergeant Hayes and his battalion, through sheer grit and determination, had played a pivotal role in the success of the landing. The immediate consequences of their actions were felt across the beachhead, where the momentum had decisively shifted in favor of the Allies. Despite the success at Utah Beach, the cost was steep. The initial landing forces had been met with fierce resistance, and casualties were high. More than 2,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day, with hundreds more among the Germans. The numbers of dead, wounded, and missing tell a grim story, but they also highlight the human cost of the struggle for freedom. The beaches, which had seemed so barren and distant just hours earlier, had now become a cemetery of sorts, a silent testament to the sacrifice of all those who had fought and died. The Germans, though caught off guard, did not immediately retreat. The initial wave of Allied landings, though successful, was far from decisive. The beachhead at Utah Beach was secured, but much work remained. The Germans, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, quickly realized that their defensive positions were being overrun. While they still held the high ground, their ability to maintain a coordinated defense was rapidly deteriorating. The unexpected audacity of the American advance, sparked by Sergeant Hayes's decision to lead his men forward, had torn through the fabric of the German defensive strategy. But the Germans were not yet defeated. They regrouped, sending reinforcements to fortify the area and slow the Allied advance. In the coming days, the Battle for Normandy would intensify. The Allies, having secured the beaches, would push inland, facing not only the remnants of the German forces but also the harsh realities of combat in unfamiliar terrain. The hedgerows of Normandy, which had seemed like a picturesque countryside before the war, now became the setting for fierce, close-quarter battles. The American forces, having landed at immense cost, were determined to press on, knowing that victory in Normandy would pave the way for the liberation of France and ultimately Western Europe. For Sergeant Hayes and the men of the 4th Infantry Division, their actions on D-Day were but the beginning of a long, arduous campaign. The initial success of the landings at Utah Beach was a critical turning point, but it was only a single step in the larger battle for Normandy. They would face many more challenges in the days to come. Yet, the courage displayed on the beaches of Normandy, especially in those early hours, would remain a source of pride for the men who survived. Their bravery had not only saved their battalion, it had played a crucial role in the overall success of Operation Overlord. The successes on D-Day, including the advances made at Utah Beach, were an early sign that the tide of war was turning. But it would take more than just tactical victories to secure the liberation of France. The Allies, buoyed by their success at Normandy, would push forward in the weeks that followed. The Allied forces would capture the vital port city of Cherbourg, and by the end of July, they would be advancing deeper into France, cutting off the German forces and forcing them into retreat. Yet, the battle for Normandy would not be easily forgotten. It had cost the lives of thousands and had marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the soldiers who fought on D-Day, the significance of their actions would never be lost. They had not only broken through the German defenses, they had proven that, even in the darkest moments of war, courage and resolve could alter the course of history. The consequences of the Allied success at Normandy reverberated far beyond the beaches of Utah and Omaha. By the time the dust had settled on June 7, 1944, the United States and its allies had gained a crucial foothold in Western Europe. The Germans, though still formidable in their retreat, had suffered a critical setback. The landing in Normandy marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would lead to the liberation of France and eventually the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the days following the landings, the Allies quickly consolidated their positions. While the struggle for the towns and villages inland from the beaches was fierce, the success of the D-Day landings had created a sense of momentum that the Germans could not easily stop. The capture of Cherbourg, a vital deep-water port, was a key turning point in the subsequent days. It allowed the Allies to bring in reinforcements and supplies at a pace that the Germans could not match. This, in turn, enabled the Allies to launch their pursuit of the retreating German forces, gaining ground at an accelerating rate. But even as the Allies pushed forward, the cost of the battle weighed heavily. The fighting in Normandy, particularly in the hedgerow country, was grueling and brutal. Soldiers were forced to fight in close quarters, where every foot of ground gained was paid for with blood. The casualties continued to mount on both sides as the Allies advanced toward Paris. The Germans, though losing ground, still fought with determination, attempting to slow the Allied advance by fighting in the dense, rural terrain. For the soldiers who had fought on Utah Beach, however, the battle was not over. Sergeant Hayes and his men, though having secured their initial objectives, faced more challenges ahead. The path forward would be lined with hardships, but the experience of D-Day, the courage shown on those first few hours of June 6th, would serve as an anchor. Hayes and his comrades understood that their actions on that day had been pivotal in ensuring the success of the entire invasion. They had taken a critical risk, pushing forward when it seemed impossible, and that risk had paid off. Their bravery would become a symbol of the resolve of all the men who fought that day. Soldiers from different nations, each facing their own unique battles, but united by a shared commitment to ending tyranny. As the Allies continued to push across France, the psychological impact of the Normandy landings reverberated throughout Europe. The successful invasion proved to the world that Nazi Germany, despite its seeming invincibility, could be defeated. For the soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division and other American forces, their fight on D-Day was the moment when the tide of the war began to turn in their favor. It was not just a military victory, it was a victory for freedom, for the values of democracy that they fought to uphold. The German forces, in retreat, would continue to resist, but the momentum had shifted. The Allies now held the initiative, and the liberation of France was no longer a distant hope. It was a reality. The war would not be over immediately, but the Normandy landings were a decisive step toward that final victory. In the years that followed, the world would come to recognize the importance of D-Day and the courage shown by the soldiers who landed on those beaches. Their sacrifice, their willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, would become a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit. The successful liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany would shape the world order in ways that are still felt today. For Sergeant Hayes and his comrades, however, the true impact of their actions could not be fully understood in the heat of battle. It was only in the aftermath, when the war was won and the memories of the bloodshed began to fade, that they could begin to grasp the significance of what they had accomplished. They had helped change the course of history, not just through their military success, but by proving that courage, leadership, and brotherhood could overcome even the most daunting challenges. The events of June 6, 1944, are etched in history as one of the pivotal moments of the Second World War, and for the men who fought on the beaches of Normandy, their actions defined not just the battle, but the essence of what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. Sergeant Hayes' decision to lead his men forward, under withering fire, became a symbol of the spirit that carried the Allies through the darkest days of the war. It was a spirit of resolve, courage, and a deep belief in the cause for which they fought, the defense of freedom, the end of tyranny, and the preservation of democracy. For those who stood on the beaches that day, the battle was not only about securing a beachhead. It was about the personal sacrifices that built the momentum of a global movement. It was about individual decisions in the midst of chaos, decisions that determined the fate of an entire campaign. And in the face of death, the survivors would carry with them not just the memory of the battles they fought, but the conviction that their bravery had contributed to the liberation of a continent and the future of humanity. The Normandy landings did not just change the course of the war, they changed the world. They marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and signaled a new era in global history, one where the values of freedom and democracy stood resilient against the forces of oppression. For the soldiers who fought there, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity's capacity for courage and self-sacrifice could light the way. The symbolism of that courage was not just in the rifles they carried or the land they won, but in the quiet resolve of men like Sergeant Hayes. In their actions, they carried the weight of countless lives and the future of millions more. And in doing so, they left an indelible mark on history, a legacy that continues to echo through the generations. In the end, it was not just the victory on the battlefield that mattered, but the moral clarity that it represented. The Allies had not simply defeated an enemy. They had defeated an ideology built on hatred, oppression, and conquest. They had shown the world that, even in the darkest times, the forces of good could rise above the shadow of tyranny. And they had proven that the courage of ordinary men, when driven by extraordinary ideals, could change the world. It is in this reflection that we find the true meaning of freedom. It is not in the absence of struggle, but in the willingness to fight for what is right, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to make the sacrifices necessary to secure a better future for all. The men who landed at Utah Beach, like Sergeant Hayes, embodied this principle. They fought not just for their own survival, but for the future of humanity, a future rooted in the ideals of liberty, justice, and peace. And it is through their sacrifice and courage that we are reminded of the enduring power of democracy, and the obligation we have to protect and cherish the freedoms that so many gave their lives to secure. Their story, etched into the annals of history, continues to inspire us all, reminding us that the fight for freedom is never truly over, that it is, in fact, a fight worth continuing generation after generation.